Eisenhower stood at the entrance of the bunker and did not go in. He had driven to Speedy Valley through the Tunisian winter in the specific, unannounced way that he always visited forward positions, without press, without ceremony, without the advance notice that would have allowed the people he was visiting to manage what he saw. This was the method. If you told a headquarters you were coming, the headquarters prepared for your arrival. If you arrived without warning, you saw what was actually there. He had driven to Speedy Valley. That was what the men called it, Speedy Valley, the name carrying in it the specific American military humor that functions as a pressure valve for things that are too serious to say directly. And what he found at Speedy Valley was not a forward command post. It was an excavation, a series of tunnels blasted into the face of a ravine by a battalion of army engineers who had been pulled from the front lines, from the actual fighting, to construct underground shelters for the commanding general of the United States Second Corps. The bunker was 70 miles from the front. Some accounts say 100. Major General Lloyd Fredendall was inside it. Eisenhower looked at what had been built. He looked at the engineers who had built it, men who should have been at the front, doing the work that combat engineers do at the front, and he said something that he would repeat in his memoirs 20 years later. It was the only time during the war that I ever saw a higher headquarters so concerned over its own safety that it dug itself underground shelters. He said it as a statement of fact. What he did not say, not then, not in the bunker at Speedy Valley, and not in any document from that visit, was what the statement meant for Fredendall's future in his command. What he decided in the weeks that followed is the subject of this video. And so is what happened after he decided it. The thing that the standard history of Kasserine Pass leaves out because it is uncomfortable, and because it complicates the clean story of a commander who saw what was wrong and fixed it. By the end of this video, you will understand why Eisenhower's decision about Fredendall was one of the most consequential personnel decisions of the war, and why the man he decided to remove from command did not, in the end, suffer the consequences that the decision should have produced. This channel covers the decisions that the official record compresses into a footnote. If you are new here, subscribe now and turn on the bell. New video every 2 days. Now, back to Tunisia, and back to what had gone wrong before Eisenhower ever drove to Speedy Valley. Lloyd Fredendall was George Marshall's man. This is the fact that explains almost everything else about what happened in Tunisia in the winter of 1943, and it is the fact that the histories of Kasserine Pass acknowledge briefly and then move past because it is inconvenient to the narrative of Fredendall as the singular cause of a disaster that had multiple authors. Marshall had personally championed Fredendall. In November of 1942, after Fredendall had commanded the Central Task Force landings at Oran in Operation Torch, Eisenhower had written to Marshall in terms that he would later describe as ironic. He wrote, "I bless the day you urged Fredendall upon me and cheerfully acknowledged that my earlier doubts of him were completely unfounded." It was the kind of letter that senior commanders write to their superiors when they are being diplomatic about a subordinate in whom they have not fully formed a view. Eisenhower had doubts. He expressed them to Marshall. Then he wrote the letter. But before we get to what the doubts had become by February, there is something about the specific institutional dynamic of the Fredendall appointment that the standard history of Kasserine Pass almost never examines. Fredendall was not just Marshall's man, he was Marshall's public endorsement. Marshall had described him to Eisenhower as one of the best. That endorsement in the hierarchical culture of the American Army in 1943 was not merely a recommendation, it was a statement of the Chief of Staff's personal judgment. Relieving Fredendall did not just remove a failed general from command, it required Eisenhower to act on evidence that contradicted the assessment of the man to whom he reported. Understanding that dynamic is the only way to understand why the decision took as long as it did, and why the outcome, after the decision was made, was what it was. By February of 1943, the doubts had acquired a great deal more evidence. The American San Corps in Tunisia had been organized by Fredendall according to a system that the officers serving under him described, variously, as baffling and dangerous. The dispositions he had made of his forces across the front violated the basic principle of mutual support, that units needed to be positioned so that they could reinforce each other when either came under attack. Fredendall had positioned them so that they could not. The 1st Armored Division, which was the II Corps' primary striking force, had been broken into pieces and distributed across a front of 150 miles. The infantry divisions that were supposed to work with the armor had been separated from it. The result was a series of isolated positions, each of which was individually vulnerable and none of which could quickly reinforce the others. He had broken the 1st Armored Division into as many as 4 separate combat commands, distributing them across the front in ways that prevented them from concentrating and supporting each other. His orders were issued in a combination of slang and obscure personal code, designed, he said, to prevent enemy interception that his own subordinates could not reliably interpret. He had located his headquarters at Speedy Valley specifically because of his fear of German air attack, and he had diverted a battalion of combat engineers from their operational duties to blast the tunnels that would protect him from that attack. At the front, the situation was fragile in ways that Fredendall was not in a position to see because Fredendall was not at the front. On February 14, 1943, 3 hours after Eisenhower himself had inspected the American positions at Fired Pass, the Germans attacked. The attack was led by elements of the German Afrika Korps and the 5th Panzer Army under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been looking at the same American defensive positions that Fredendall's dispositions had created, and who had concluded, correctly, that they presented an opportunity. What followed was the most humiliating defeat suffered by American forces in the European theater of the Second World War. The I Corps lost more than 6,000 men in 10 days. Units were overrun. The Americans were pushed back 50 miles. Rommel drove through Kasserine Pass, a gap in the Atlas Mountains in central Tunisia, and for a period that seemed to confirm the British High Command's private assessment that the Americans were not yet ready to fight the Germans at the level the campaign required. At Speedy Valley, Fredendall sent orders. The orders, transmitted in his personal code over the radio, were interpreted with varying degrees of accuracy by the men who received them. Several subordinate commanders later described the orders as incomprehensible. The front was collapsing, and the commanding general of the I Corps was 70 to 100 miles away, in a bunker dug by men who should have been at the front, issuing orders that his own officers could not reliably decode. On February 20th, Eisenhower sent Major General Ernest Harmon, commander of the 2nd Armored Division, to Speedy Valley as Fredendall's deputy. Harmon arrived at 3 in the morning. He found Fredendall groggy and, by Harmon's description, visibly broken by the weight of what was happening. Fredendall gave Harmon a note authorizing him to take charge. Then he went to bed. Harmon stabilized the front. He was able to do this partly because the German offensive had already reached its operational limit. Rommel's supply lines were stretched. The Allied reinforcements that Eisenhower had rushed forward had stiffened the defense at Thala and T-Bessa, and the German attack was already beginning to lose momentum. When Harmon reported back to Eisenhower, he used words that the accounts of this period preserve with precision. Fredendall, Harmon said, was no damn good. In early March, Eisenhower pulled Omar Bradley aside at T-Bessa. Bradley had recently completed an inspection of the I Corps. Eisenhower asked him about the situation. Bradley's answer was 3 words: "It's pretty bad." On March 5, 1943, Eisenhower relieved Fredendall of command. But here is what the decision cost Eisenhower before he made it, and why the 4 weeks between Harmon's return from Speedy Valley and the relief order are the most revealing weeks in the entire Kasserine story. Eisenhower knew what Harmon had said. He knew what Bradley had said. He had the testimony of multiple senior officers who had seen Fredendall's command from the inside and had independently reached the same conclusion. He had his own observation from the visit to Speedy Valley. He had the casualty figures from Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine and the 50-mile retreat that those figures represented. He had everything he needed to act, and he spent 4 weeks confirming what he already knew before he acted on it. Not because he doubted the evidence, because he understood what acting on the evidence meant in terms of Marshall and the institutional machinery above him. He replaced him with George Patton. The decision was correct. Patton's impact on the II Corps was immediate and visible, and the speed and completeness of the transformation is itself evidence of what had been wrong. The same men who had retreated 50 miles under Fredendall's command were, within 10 days of Patton's arrival, performing at a level that vindicated the operational potential the Army's training had been supposed to produce. The 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Armored Division, the 34th Infantry Division. The men had not changed, the leadership had changed, and the difference between what those men had produced under Fredendall and what they produced under Patton was the difference between the potential of a force and what happens to that potential when the leadership above it is not equal to what the situation requires. The tightening of discipline, the restoration of operational confidence, the specific energy of a commander who drove to the front rather than tunneling under a ravine to hide from it. When Patton took the IA Corps through El Gueta in late March, the performance was different enough from what had preceded it that it vindicated, retroactively, the argument that the problem at Kasserine had been leadership rather than the men. The men had not been the problem. And here is the part of the Fredendall story that the standard military history of the North African campaign presents and then moves past too quickly. Because Eisenhower's decision to relieve Fredendall, the correct decision, made on the basis of evidence that was overwhelming and that multiple senior officers had independently confirmed, did not produce the consequences that the decision implied. Fredendall was not court-martialed. He was not publicly disgraced. He was not even quietly retired. And this is the part of the story that the histories of Kasserine Pass handle the least honestly. Because the promotion of Fredendall to Lieutenant General in June of 1943 was not an administrative error or an oversight or a case of the left hand not knowing what the right hand had done. It was a decision. It was the deliberate product of the same institutional reasoning that had protected Fredendall's career before Kasserine and that continued to protect it after. And understanding why it happened, understanding the specific mechanism by which the American military in 1943 managed the public consequences of a senior officer's failure, is the part of the Kasserine story that actually tells you something about how institutions work. He was sent home to the United States, and in June of 1943, 4 months after the relief, 3 months after Patton had demonstrated at El Gueta what the IO Corps could do under competent leadership, Fredendall was promoted to Lieutenant General. He was given command of the Second Army, a training command, safe from the Germans, safe from any operational situation that would test him again. He was greeted in the press accounts that covered his return as a returning hero. This outcome was the product of a specific set of decisions made at the level above Eisenhower, at the level of George Marshall, who had personally championed Fredendall, who had described him as one of the best, and who now faced the institutional problem that senior officials always face when a public appointment produces a public failure. The failure had to be acknowledged in some form. The relief of Fredendall was public. It had been reported. It could not be simply erased from the record. But the acknowledgement could be managed. The management consisted of making the relief as quiet as possible and the return as positive as possible, so that what the public understood about Fredendall's departure from the I Corps was shaped by what the Army chose to communicate, rather than by what had actually happened in the bunker at Speedy Valley. The solution that Marshall chose was the one that institutions typically choose when a senior official's failure threatens to embarrass the person who appointed them. The failure was acknowledged privately. It was managed publicly. The official was reassigned rather than sanctioned, promoted rather than demoted, congratulated rather than investigated. The men who had been at Sidi Bouzid and at Kasserine Pass, the men who had been pushed back 50 miles by a German force that their commander's dispositions had made their defeat almost inevitable, went back to the war under new leadership and eventually to victory. Fredendall went to Memphis, Tennessee, where the Second Army's headquarters was located, and trained soldiers. Eisenhower wrote a letter to President Roosevelt. The letter, in the careful diplomatic language of a supreme commander managing the institutional sensitivities of a situation he did not fully control, communicated what Eisenhower's aide later summarized without elaboration, that Fredendall should be reassigned to a training command. The letter did not say what Harman had said, that Fredendall was no damn good. It did not say what Bradley had said, it's pretty bad. It did not say what Eisenhower himself had observed at Speedy Valley and what the casualty figures from Kasserine had demonstrated about the consequences of that observation. It said what a letter from Eisenhower to the president about a Marshall protégé was required to say in order to produce the outcome Eisenhower wanted, the removal, without the political complications that a more direct account would have generated. It was the language of institutional navigation rather than the language of accountability. Eisenhower was not above that language. He used it when the situation required it. The situation required it. The relief was the act that Eisenhower controlled. What happened to Fredendall after the relief was not. This is the tension at the center of the Kasserine story that the standard narrative of decisive command and lessons learned does not fully account for. Eisenhower made the right call. The right call, within the institutional system he was operating in, produced an outcome that was partly right and partly a managed avoidance of institutional accountability. Fredendall should not have been promoted. He was promoted. The men at Kasserine Pass had lost more than 6,000 of their number to, among other causes, leadership that had dug itself into a bunker 70 miles from the fighting and issued orders its own subordinates could not decode. That leadership was removed. It was also rewarded. Eisenhower remarked, years later, that the most important decisions a commander makes are personnel decisions. He had been saying this in various forms since before the war, in the Army War College lectures of the 1930s, in the staff papers he had written under MacArthur in the Philippines, in the conversations with Marshall that had shaped his own rise through the ranks in the years before Torch. He believed it as a principle. He had been applying it in Tunisia, and the application of it had produced a correct decision that the institutional system had then partially undone. The principle remained intact. The institution had found a way around it. That the selection and retention and relief of the people who hold authority within an organization is the decision that determines everything else, because everything else flows from who the people are and whether they are equal to what is being asked of them. At Kasserine Pass, the wrong person had been in command. Eisenhower identified this correctly and acted on it correctly. The action he took, the relief of Fredendall, the replacement with Patton, the reorganization of the I Corps that followed, was the decision that the situation required. What happened after the decision was the system doing what systems do when accountability threatens to become uncomfortable. Eisenhower had relieved Fredendall, the system had promoted him. And this is the part of the story that reaches past Tunisia, past 1943, past the specific institutional politics of Marshall and the army and the management of public perception in a democracy at war. Because the mechanism that protected Fredendall, the reassignment rather than sanction, the promotion rather than demotion, the congratulation rather than investigation, was not unique to 1943 or to the American military or to the specific circumstances of Kasserine Pass. It is the mechanism that institutions deploy when accountability threatens to become embarrassing to the people who made the original appointment. The specific names change, the mechanism does not. The men at Kasserine Pass got a new commander. They went on, under Patton and then under Bradley, to fight their way through Tunisia and Sicily and Normandy and across France and into Germany. They learnt the hard lessons that Kasserine had taught. They became, by the end of the war, one of the best armies the United States had ever fielded. Fredendall got 3 stars. He commanded the 2nd Army in Memphis, Tennessee until 1946. He retired that year with the rank of Lieutenant General. He died in 1962 at the age of 79. The men who had been in the bunker at Speedy Valley were long gone. That is the full accounting of what happened when Eisenhower decided that a general had failed. Not the clean version, the real one. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment below. What should have happened to Fredendall? Every comment gets read.